Chapter 6: Employee and Industry Relations. The idea of employee relations is a loaded one. Many may think that the idea behind it is too abstract that cannot be subjected to a systematic and grounded explanation. Some may agree that to capture the essence of what it is about would be a tall order, given the complexity of variables involved in discussing its dynamic.
Employee relations versus industrial relations. Over the past few decades, there has been confusion between the two terms. A debate regarding the nuances between the concept of employee relations and industrial relations has continuously been contested. Many see the need to differentiate the two. Others, they can be used interchangeably. Blyton and Trumbull, 1994. What is industrial relations? The term is synonymous and associated with collectives such as mass movement of workers, trade unions, and others. It was also linked to industrial work, such as the manufacturing sector labor-intensive task and factory worker that are full-time. The tone of industrial relations were thought of to be more focus on collective actions such as bargaining agreement. What employee relations? J. The term revolves around the smaller subset of industries and goes beyond the collective such as trade unions are no longer just focused on factory work, manufacturing job, but now also includes the services sector, non-unions, entities, part-time, and contractual workers. Both industrial and employee relations are areas of research related to the conditions and relationships that exist in the workplace, but differences exist between them. Broadly speaking, industrial relations focus on the relationships that exist between an employer and the employees' collective.
Rizzo stated that a psychological contract is an individual's belief in mutual obligations between that person and another party, such as an employer. Good day, I am Milka Miguabis and I'm going to explain further psychological contract and why it matters. What is psychological contract? According to definition, a psychological contract is a intangible agreement between both parties binds the relationship between the employer and their employees. This means that the relationship within the corporate structure is guided and predicted on a set of practices and expectations between them. There exist various sets of assumptions that may not be bound by a solid contract but are, nonetheless, practices that are accepted and expected in the relationship between the employee and their employers. Below are the examples of norms. First, both parties observe fairness and transparency. It is carried out by mean treatment without discrimination and implies openness, communication, and accountability inside the organization. Second, employee impacts and value are recognized and rewarded by their employer in various forms such as benefits, tenure, or career growth. And lastly, both employer and employee will work toward the shared goal and growth that will be beneficial for both parties based on shared values, mores, and vision. The set norms between employer and employer relationship provide the necessary environment for co-creating value for the workplace environment. Reciprocity exists in this interaction where the employer extracts values from the labor generated by its subjects, while at the same time, employees earn monetary compensation, security, and self-fulfillment. Once attained, this psychological contract drives employee satisfaction and motivation, which in turn creates more value to the organization through better work quality and output. Adding to the broad prescriptions above, The employees themselves seek specific conditions that will further elevate their sense of belongingness and self-actualization, which could be, but are not limited to, the set of examples listed: community building among peers, tenure and security, corporate mobility and promotions, expansion of skill sets and training, humane treatment, work or life balance or integration, having their voices and suggestions heard by the management, impacts in performance are truly rewarded, and lastly, flexibility in tasks and processes. For this to work flawlessly, the industry also sets its standards on its employees in a cycle where both mutually benefit from their work engagement. These are proactive and willing to learn, has the necessary skills and competence to work on designated tasks, a team player willing to work with others, focus on achieving the goals set by the organization, and lastly, has the initiative to work on tasks with minimal supervision. However, it has to be understood that these are not the only expectations that the both employee and employer may demand from each other, since it may vary from different scenarios, organizational dynamics, intensity, extensity, and other forms. What is common is that the harmony between the employer and employee must exert the best effort to derive the best from their work and tasks, therefore elevating overall productivity and value across the organizational hierarchy.
The challenge for both is to find the right compromise in reconciling many of their differences and instill a system that can operationalize and standardize practices. Failure to meet at a compromise from both parties may mean additional opportunity and transactional cost. This is the worst case scenario, and therefore it is the best interest of the employers and employees to arrive at the best compromise that will be fair and just for all. Job satisfaction is an instance where the dynamic is being studied. Employee satisfaction is measured through surveys regarding various aspects of their jobs and each employee's views regarding it. Questions may be asked to raise discussions on reward systems, compensation, conflict resolution, community relations, work processes, and others in both external and intrinsic levels. Example of factors are power, influence, control, and freedom regarding the task given. 2 is self-actualization and fulfillment when doing their jobs. 3, respect among peers and working relationship in the workplace. 4th is the compensation. 5th is the recognition of the personal value.
Relationship attachment, compliance commitment. The word itself conjures ideas of submission and power. In the relationship between employee and employer. Compliance has different forms and root sources of power present in this. Interactions at Cioni, 1975. Sources of power: coercive punishment, remunerative financial reward, normative symbolic awards tied to values held by the company. Forms of involvement: alienative, negative, or antagonistic, calculative, careful and thoughtful of choices, moral, positive, and in accordance with norms set by the company. Furthermore, he explained that the sources of power and forms of involvement could be combined, making it 9 different combinations. An example of this is if a worker's involvement or reaction toward a task is alienating or negative, resulting in him or her being negligent, then it could be best for the company to be coercive toward the employee to correct the action or subdue the damage to be incurred. Lastly, suppose an employee acted positively and is in line with the moral standards and examples by the organization. In the case, the individual may be given awards of recognition that may bring prestige to the one to be rewarded. Commitment. Again, following at Cioni, commitment is about involvement or moral bond between employer and employee and sharing an optimistic view that leads to a mutually beneficial Relationship. In the 90s, commitment is defined as a belief, leading to employees creating positive value and even beyond. The expected output. On both definitions, commitment is assumed as a bond between employees and employers and a behavior that can be described and differentiated from others. Attitudinal commitment. Commitment that can be distinguished with the psychological bond of the employer and employee that is held by common norms and values. Behavioral commitment. Commitment that can be described as going beyond expectations or loyalty to the company. It should noted that differences in work environments depend on the culture, industry need, contractual obligations, and traditions of the environment. The relationship of the employer to their employees should not be seen as a one-way street where one party sends message to another. End of the story. In reality, the norms, attitudes, and culture are created by the reciprocation of actors. As one sends a message to the other, she then interprets it and gives theirs feedback, vice versa.
Two sides of the coin: cooperation and conflict. Relationship between the employee and the employer is best achieved in an environment of mutual support and transparency to reach certain desired goals. However, relationship is never linear nor is ensured. Cooperation and conflict exist and are a part of this ongoing and never-ending interaction. The interaction is further developed through the constant construction and reconstruction of norms and beliefs to suit the interests of both parties. Central to this relationship is the idea of perspective that different actors have. It should be clarified that perspective is not the view per se, but it is the way or approach to view a certain idea, context, or worldview. Fox 1996 identified that this frame of reference has three different frames, and theses are unitarist, pluralist, and radical Marxist references, which were then expanded in the 90s with the inclusion of the feminist perspective. Unitarism. As the term suggests, it is a view that assumes that companies and their employees are like-minded and thus share various commonalities, such as norms and aspirations. Example, the idea of a family or pushing for communal spirit across organization. In this view, conflict should be avoided at all cost, and is seen as distraction in the workplace. Therefore, for a unitarist, conflict is a direct result of poor communication. Pluralism accepts the notion that there are differences in objectives, norms, and perspectives, which then creates groups or unions. The difference between unitarism and pluralism is that pluralism looks into the diversity of individuals and acknowledges it. Example, conflict may arise on the bounds of job roles and processes that may differ from group to group. For a pluralist, these kinds of conflicts are welcomed and anticipated. Radical Marxists. The employer is seen as the evil that merely exploits workers for labor to derive surplus value, which is only accessible to capitalists and not the laborers themselves, to make profit. It is acknowledged by the believers of this perspective that it can only be extracted by employing cheap labor. It is understood in this perspective that labor plus technology plus capital equals goods and services, with surplus value. Therefore, Marxist is an employee relation that merely one-sided and exploitative, which is impossible to resolve unlike unitarist and pluralist. Conflict in this sense is unavoidable and resolution is impossible because Marxists only see compromise and bargaining as a surrender to the capitalist.
Industrial relations as a system. In 1958, a man named J.T. Dunlop created the idea of industrial relations as a system. For Dunlop, he sees the system rooted in the ideas of inputs, process, and outputs. Outputs. Dunlop sees outputs defined by substantive and procedural rules that manage the main characters or actors within an industrial environment. The difference in substantive and procedural rules for some is rather unclear and hard to grasp. Substantive rules. This is result of rules such as hourly wages. Procedural rules results of compromises about the system. Procedural rules commonly define substantive rules in the simplest sense. Substantive rules emanate from procedural rules, such as an example of how both parties negotiate wages. Outputs are the outcomes of this that then in turn governs the system moving forwards. These procedural rules vary from culture, customs, and ethics not only from the perspective of organizations but also from country to country. Input. Again, for Dunlop, there are three pillars that are independent variables under inputs. These are actors, context, and ideology. In actors, this is a group comprised of laborers who are not part of the managerial level. It is a group comprised of managers that may also include employee collectives. It is exogenous agencies that exist beyond the employees or employer relations, such as government agencies, national labor associations, and others. Next is the context. Market influence. Economics and the market play a huge part in industrial relations, such as that of emerging market trends, a global competition that pressures firms to be more accommodating and flexible to employee terms. Technological influence. The impact of disruptive innovation plays an important role in the system, such as that of drastic changes to production practices, which will force the industry to adapt to the skill sets, manpower requirements, and labor to achieve targets. Ideology. It is simply the totality of values, beliefs, ideas, and more that are reinforced and shared by all actors across the different hierarchies. Ideologies that are shared stronger by the actors corresponds to a better working relationship and harmonious environment, making the system more stable. Process synthesis in inputs and outputs. For the system to find a consensus, the inputs are turned to outputs with the help of a process in which actors are subjected. This process includes collective bargaining agreements and resolving the conflict by arriving at a consensus where both parties agree upon. Another way is through arbitration, through a third party, or in some severe cases, government intervention to resolve the case. In some other cases, there is no longer a need to tap other parties because it is already resolved at the early phase when one party gives way to the other.
NutriAsia striking workers initiated violence. Why NutriAsia workers are on strike? The workers were on strike for 12 days to protest alleged contractualization, low wages, and unhealthy working conditions. Meanwhile, the firm said some 200 striking workers of toll packer B. Merck and their supporters sparked the violence when they allegedly fired a shot in the air and started to throw rocks at police and guard trucks to maintain peace and order. This happened 3 days after the duly instructed the non-striking majority of toll packers employees to return to work. It is unfortunate that the strikers staged a violent attack while a duly led mediation meeting among stakeholders, including the union organizer. A union organizer is a specific type of trade union member or an appointed union. Duly purpose is to empower gainful employment, develop human resources, safeguards, and promote the welfare of workers and maintain industrial harmony. It added that the striking workers and their sympathizers violated the writ of primary injunction issued by the Malolos Regional Trial Court or RTC, which ordered the Independent Workers Union and all the other persons acting under its authority, direction, or control during the pendency of this case. The company also called out the strikers for allegedly using children and the elderly as a frontliners and human shield in barricading the plant entry points. These children and elderly clearly have nothing to do with the labor issue at hand. We appeal for calm among the strikers and their supporters and would like to let the public know the situation is currently in the hands and under control by the Philippine National Police. We appeal to everyone to comply with the rule of law as we all seek the peaceful resolution.